Well, tonight we're looking at Acts chapter 27, verse 39, and then we're going to make it all the way to chapter 28 and verse 10. And I just want to begin with a review. These final two chapters in the book of Acts deal with Paul's journey to Rome and then his witness in Rome. And 3/4 of the material is his journey to Rome. And then the book kind of concludes with his witness once he arrives in Rome. So the journey to Rome started at chapter 27, verse 1, and we'll go all the way to chapter 28, verse 16. And next week, we will make it to Rome. So it's taken us about 4 weeks to get there. It took Paul a lot longer, but we will make it to Rome by next week. It all begins with the journey to Fair Havens. And just a quick review on the map. Paul starts out at Caesarea. He goes to Sidon. And then he goes all the way up to Myra, passing through the lee of Cyprus, which gave them a break from the wind. And that part of the journey was very smooth. It went just as planned. The next leg of the journey means switching boats at Myra. The small boat that Paul was on would never make it to Rome. So he gets on a rather large boat. There's 276 people on this boat. And you've got to think first century boat. Don't think modern cruise ship or battleship. Think first century boat. And there's 276 people, and there's a lot of grain on the boat, cargo. And the grain came from Alexandria, Egypt. In fact, this boat came from Alexandria, Egypt. It went straight north to Myra, and that's where Paul and his friends get on the boat. The next part of the journey is to make it to the island of Crete. And if things would have gone well, they would have ended up in Salmone or perhaps Phoenix. That's not where they end up. They run into some wind issues, which pushes them south, and they end up in Fair Havens. That's not where they wanted to be. In fact, the next part of the text is a discussion, an argument about whether or not to stay at Fair Havens for the winter or try to move forward. And Paul says we should stay here. But the owner of the boat, who may have also been the captain of the boat, said, "No, I don't trust this location for the winter. I want to go to Phoenix." And so they decide to set out towards Phoenix, which should have been a very easy thing to do because they don't have to go that far. They're at Fair Havens. They simply need to go to Phoenix. It should have been an easy journey. It starts out with a gentle south wind, and everything was wonderful until the northeaster hit. And that hits in verses 13 through 20. And that blows them completely off course. They completely go south of Phoenix, and for 14 days, they are literally lost at sea. They're in the middle of a huge storm. They have no idea where they are. Back then, you didn't have a compass. You didn't have all the technology we have today. You basically looked at the stars, but the problem was you couldn't see the stars because it was overcast and it was raining. It was horrible. In chapter 27, verse 20, everybody on the boat, all 276 of them, have concluded we're going to die at sea. And it's at that moment that God intervenes. And here's just kind of an artist rendition of this. We have no idea how they get from Fair Havens to Malta, but this is how one author drew it. The only person who really knows the route was God, because even the people on the boat didn't know where they were. So, but they end up going west, and they end up in Malta. That's where they're going to end up 14 days later. So, in verse 21, God gives Paul some assurance. An angel visits him and basically tells him, you're going to Rome. I made you a promise a couple of years ago that you were going to Rome. I'm going to keep my promise. you're going to arrive safely in Rome, and everyone on the boat will remain safe as well. However, the cargo and the ship will be destroyed. That was God's word to Paul. And Paul shares that message with everybody else on board, which at that point, they all thought they were going to die. So it was good news. It was words of assurance. We're not going to die, but we will lose the boat and we will lose the cargo. Then there's the prospect of landing. They get close. They can hear out in the distance, it sounds like the waves are crashing against some rocks, which that's good news and bad news. The good news is we're getting close to land. The bad news is we're getting close to rocks. That's the bad news. So they take a sounding to try to figure out the depth, and they drop something into the water and measure it. It's 120 feet deep, and they measure again maybe a half hour later, maybe an hour later, and it's 90 feet deep. At that point, it's the middle of the night. And the last thing you want to do is crash the boat into some rocks in the middle of the night. So they decide to basically put out anchor at that point and wait until morning. And once morning comes, they'll be able to see where they're going. They can make it safely to shore. That is the plan. Paul gives them some words of encouragement. If you can imagine being at sea for 14 days in an ancient boat, it's probably going like this, most of the time. You're not going to eat much food, and if you do eat food, you may not keep it down, It's 14 days of being seasick. So everybody at that point, Paul says, we need to eat. We've anchored, things have calmed down. We need to eat because we're going to all survive, but you're going to need your strength to make it to shore. So Paul takes bread, he breaks it, he eats it, and gives a Jewish prayer, and everybody else follows and eats bread as well. So now they're ready in the morning to reach land safely. That's the plan. And that's where we pick up tonight. So I want to do this section by section, and let me read the first section, which is chapter 27, verses 39 through 44. Then we'll talk about that, and then we'll move on to chapter 28. So beginning with verse 39, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. So finally, after a whole chapter, they're finally going to reach their destination. So when daylight comes, and again, they're out in the water, they've put out anchor, and they're just waiting so they can see to try to get this boat safely to land. So they do not recognize the land, which is interesting because it is Malta. And most of the crew on the ship have been to Malta many, many times. This would not have been a new thing for them. The problem is the grand harbor of Valletta is where they would normally go. But that's not where they are. They're on a different part of the island. And they're on Point Cora, which, by the way, Point Cora today is called St. Paul's Bay. Why is it called that? Because scholars believe that's where they crashed the boat, in what is now called St. Paul's Bay. So they see a creek with a sandy beach, and they decide to try to run this ship aground into the beach. I found a modern picture of St. Paul's Beach, and here it is. Looks like a beautiful vacation spot, but it gives us a little bit of perspective. Of course, this is the 21st century. We're not exactly sure what it looked like in the first century, but some of the features would be the same. This is apparently the beach where they run the ship aground, or at least try to. And when it talks about the bay, that's kind of what this is. It's kind of a narrow channel that leads right into the beach. So no wonder they didn't recognize it. You would not normally dock a boat there. But again, they've been at sea for 14 days and they're just looking for land, and they're not about to try to move around to try to find someplace else. So this is kind of what it looks like. So they do the necessary things in verse 40. They cut loose the anchors. 4 anchors are tied to the stern. They cut those anchors and let them fall into the water. Then they untie the ropes that held the rudders. And back then, rudders were like paddles, and in the storm, you got to bring them inside and tie them down. But now that the storm's over, they let them out, and the rudders would help guide the ship. They also have the foresail, which is at the bow of the ship, and is also used to guide the ship. So at this point, they're doing everything right. This should be successful until verse 41. They strike a sandbar and run aground. Back then, they didn't have the navigation equipment that we have today. They had no idea that they were about to hit a very low place and run the ship aground. Apparently, that sandbar today no longer exists. Apparently, it's been washed away. But back in the first century, it existed, and they ran right into it. So the bow stuck fast. This would have been mud or even some clay that they hit, which would cause the bow to stick, and they're not going anywhere. The stern would then be exposed to the waves, and it basically destroyed the boat. And you can imagine this boat for 14 days endured a storm. It was a storm kind of like a hurricane at one point, and so the boat probably just simply collapsed at that point, and no one was able to save the boat. Interesting comment in verse 42 that the soldiers are now planning to kill the prisoners. Now, if you were a Roman soldier, you were assigned certain prisoners. It was your responsibility to keep an eye on them and to keep them from running off. If you lose a prisoner, you could lose your life. So the soldiers are thinking at this point, what if some of the prisoners can outswim us and they can swim to shore and then just take off running? And again, they have no idea where they are. If they knew this was Malta, they probably wouldn't have thought that way, because Malta is only 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. It's just a small island. But they're thinking, we don't know where this is, and if they get to shore first and take off, we may never find them again, and we could lose our life. So it was a very serious concern. They were thinking about themselves and their lives, and that made a whole lot of sense. And apparently the soldiers, maybe they didn't swim very well, so, they didn't have a chance to do that. But the centurion wants to spare Paul's life. And so he keeps them from carrying out their plan. Throughout this journey, the centurion's name is Julius. And it appears that Paul and Julius are becoming friends. At least they highly respect each other, and they treat each other kindly. The centurion on the boat, Julius, is in charge of the boat. He's the highest-ranking Roman official. He makes all the final decisions. And up to this point, everything Paul has told him has been correct. And at this point, Julius is thinking, I don't want to lose this guy. I mean, he's already told us that we're going to live and everybody's going to be fine, so I don't want him to die. So their friendship had something to do with Paul's life being spared. So they wrecked the boat on a sandbar, and I'm not sure the distance between that point and the shore, the beach, but I do know there's only one way to get there, and that's to swim. There's no other possibility of getting there. So the centurion says that those who could swim jump overboard first and go to land. So that would have been the easy part of the journey. Now, at this point, it's worth pointing out that since this journey to Rome has started, there are at least 4 occasions on which Paul's life could have ended. The first one was the storm. They spent 14 days lost at sea. And they had all pretty much concluded that we're going to die at sea. If they would have hit a sandbar while they were out in the middle of the sea, it would have been over for all of them. But it doesn't happen. They survive. And then the shipwreck. Fortunately, the shipwreck was close to shore. If the ship had been wrecked out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, nobody would have survived. And then there's the story of the soldiers who want to kill the prisoners, and Paul was one of them. His life could have ended then, too. And of course, in the next story, you got to have a snake story. So we have a snake story in the next story. Well, verse 44, the rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. So if you didn't know how to swim, look for a piece of the ship that's been wrecked and just try to float to shore. Actually, the Greek phrase, talking about pieces of the ship, can also mean on the back of a person. So it could be that some of them kind of got on the back of a swimmer and the swimmer took them to shore as well. Which these 276 people have just spent a lot of time together and have just gone through a horrible experience together. So there was probably a lot of camaraderie at this point. So if your buddy needed help, you probably were willing to help him. And then everyone reached land in safety. It ends there, and that's exactly how the prophecy was supposed to go. The angel had told Paul, you're going to lose the ship and lose the cargo. Well, we just talked about them losing the ship. They had lost the cargo on 2 occasions. Very early on, they had thrown some of the cargo overboard in order to lighten the ship. And as they were getting ready to go into shore, they threw the rest of the cargo into the sea as well. So they lose the cargo, they lose the ship, but everybody makes it safely to land. And that is exactly what the angel had told Paul. Yes, question? Oh, and how many knew how to swim back in the first century? I have no idea. Yeah. I would think that the crew would know how to swim, if your livelihood was, to be on a boat. But I guess it would just depend upon what you did for a living and whether or not you were able to do that. In fact, Luke doesn't tell us. In fact, Luke doesn't even tell us if he knows how to swim or if Paul does. But he just emphasizes the point that everybody makes it safely. Well, we're going to move on to the next story, and that's the snake story. Paul's deliverance from the snake, and that's chapter 28, verses 1 through 6. So let me read the verses first, and then we'll talk about them. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, They changed their minds and said he was a god. So a fascinating thing happens once they finally get to land. Well, once safely on shore, they find out that the island is called Malta. And I'm sure at this point that the crew is thinking, wish I would have known that, because chances are they could have found the harbor. And if they would have found the harbor, they could have docked the boat and the ship would have been saved. But that wasn't what God said was going to happen. And they had no idea at that time where they were. It's actually quite a miracle in the sense that they left Fair Havens. They're trying to get to Rome. If there would have been no storm, they would have probably ended up in Sicily, which was and Malta's only 58 miles away. So the miracle of this whole thing is, even though they were in a storm, they pretty much ended up where they wanted to go. God had enabled them to do that. And they end up on this little island called Malta. Again, it's 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. Not a large place. The people of Malta are talked about in verse 2. Luke calls them the islanders, at least that's how the NIV translates it. It's actually the word barbarian. And back in the first century, if you did not know how to speak Greek, you were considered a barbarian. The Greeks had the empire before the Romans, and the Greeks tried to turn everybody in the world into a Greek, which is one of the reasons why when the Romans conquered the Greeks, it was the Greek language that still remained the popular language. It wasn't Latin, it was Greek. And so the language of the people, the language of the marketplace was Greek. And if you did not know how to speak Greek, you were considered a barbarian. The people of Malta were from Phoenician descent. They had their own native language. We would have expected such people to be hostile towards strangers. They didn't want strangers invading their territory. But these individuals show unusual kindness. There's a theme that Luke is introducing at this point. It's the theme of kindness, hospitality, treating others well. And it's amazing throughout this chapter how Paul and the crew is treated while they're at Malta. And this whole theme of hospitality and kindness. And obviously, Luke wants Christians to show hospitality and kindness to each other. And he's even suggesting that non-Christians should show kindness and hospitality toward Christians. That's kind of what he's getting at this point. So all 276 of them are welcomed by the people of Malta. And so they built a fire and welcomed us because it was raining and cold. And there's a question of, did they build one huge fire for all 276 people, or did they build multiple small fires? And Luke only mentions the fire where he happened to be. So, good question. We don't know for sure. Chances are they built multiple fires in various groups of people. Well, apparently the fire was very important to Paul, and apparently it was beginning to go a little dim, so Paul decides he's going to help out the fire. So he grabs some brushwood, some sticks, some twigs to throw it on the fire. But when he does, he finds out that not only did he pick up some twigs, he picked up a snake. And when the snake gets near the fire, which at this point the snake was probably in a cold-blooded stupor because of the weather, but when the heat gets on the snake revives and it fastens itself on Paul's hand. The snake is called a viper, and this snake has caused a lot of discussion among scholars because today on the island of Malta, there are no poisonous snakes. Another good reason to vacation there. Beautiful beach, no poisonous snakes. It's a great spot if you're looking for a vacation spot. But just because there are no poisonous snakes today doesn't mean there were not poisonous snakes back in the first century. And Malta has been heavily populated through the centuries, and chances are that the population killed off all the poisonous snakes because nobody likes poisonous snakes, especially me. So get rid of the snakes. So Paul gets bit by a snake. When it says it fastened itself, vipers don't coil, they bite. And so Paul gets bit by a snake. Can you imagine the luck? You survive 14 days, lost at sea in the middle of a horrible storm. The boat crashes, you make it to shore, and you're going, whew, got it made now. Then you get bit by a snake. What kind of luck is that? Well, the people of Malta are thinking that too. And so they're thinking, okay, this guy survived all of that, but now he gets bit. Why? Well, he must be a bad person. He must have committed some kind of horrible crime. He must be a murderer. And the gods are getting even with him. Maybe the people of Malta are thinking about the story of Jonah. It was Jonah's fault that the storm came on that boat and destroyed all of that. And Jonah has to get thrown overboard before the storm goes away. So maybe they're thinking this whole thing is Paul's fault. The gods were out to get him. They didn't get him, but now they've come up with another plan. You survived at sea, but now the snake will give you justice. In fact, justice is capitalized because in their minds, this was the goddess Justice who dishes out appropriate punishments for those who do wrong things. And we kind of think this way too sometimes. I've watched several baseball games. The batter will get up the first time and he'll really smash the ball. And it looks like it's going to go in the gap for a double, and the outfielder dives and makes the catch, robbing the guy of a double. The next time he gets up, he does a check swing, barely hits the ball. The ball goes dribbling down the third baseline, and he ends up safe at first. And I've heard many announcers say that the baseball gods were just evening the score. He creamed the ball the first time and he got it out. He barely hits it the next time and he gets a hit, and the baseball gods have evened things up for the batter. We kind of think that way too, and that's the mentality of these people. They're thinking that the gods have just gotten even with Paul. He must be a bad person. He's the cause of all the trouble, and now justice has finally been served. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. Kind of get the impression that Paul isn't even fazed by this. Just got bit by a snake and he just shakes it off. It goes into the fire and nothing bad is happening to Paul. Justice was not after Paul. God's protection was again upon Paul, because God made a promise. What was the promise? You're going to make it safely to Rome. And in order for him to make it safely to Rome, he has to survive the snake bite. And it's interesting that Luke is there, and Luke's a doctor, but don't think of doctor in the first century the same way we would in the 21st century. Doctors today can do incredible things. Doctors in the first century couldn't do a whole lot of anything. So Luke wasn't thinking, no big deal, I'm a doctor, I'll, step in. That's not going to happen. But Paul suffers no ill effects. Now, if you hold this theory, which is a very common theory because the Romans had stories of those who survived a shipwreck, but they were guilty of crimes, and they go to the beach and they get bit by a snake and they die. Even the Jewish people had stories of snakes biting people to bring justice upon them. So what do you conclude now? You know, the man was obviously a murderer, but wait a second. He's not swelling up. He's not dropping over dead. So who is this guy? So they expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But they waited a long time and nothing happened. So they changed their minds and said he was a god. Talk about a change of perspective. You know, Paul went from being a potential murderer to a god in just a few minutes. But that was their perspective. Now, this was not the first time that Paul was called a god. The people of Lystra, back in Acts chapter 14, called Paul and Barnabas gods. Paul immediately rebuked them in chapter 14. But it's interesting, as Luke tells the story, Paul doesn't say anything. That's the end of the story. They thought he was a god, story over. But Luke's readers by now know that the people of Malta were very incorrect in calling Paul a god. He's not a god. It's very inappropriate to do that. And there's really no reason, perhaps, to explain over and over again that Paul is not a god. What is Luke emphasizing? God's protection. It didn't matter if Paul was at sea in a storm or on land getting bit by a snake. God made a promise. And when God makes a promise, He keeps His promises. And for us today, going through some really horrible times with COVID, and we're seeing, loved ones passing away, lots and lots of people getting sick, God keeps His promises. God doesn't take back His promises. We have hope in this life, but we have hope beyond this life. God gives us a lot of promises of life eternal, life forever with Him. And there's a lot of prophecies in the Bible that are not fulfilled yet. And so we have great hope that Jesus one day will return. And all of those prophecies will be fulfilled. God made a promise. Some of those promises are 2,500 years old, or if not more. But God's going to keep His promise. And we can count on that. And that's Luke's point. God always keeps His promises. And if God tells Paul, you're going to Rome, Paul's going to Rome. Well, there's one last story that we're going to look at tonight, and that's the hospitality of Publius. And that's in chapter 28, verses 7 through 10. In verse 7, it says, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home, and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. Paul is going to spend 3 months on Malta. And I hit that by accident, didn't I? He spends 3 months on Malta. It's the winter months. They're not going anywhere for 3 months. It's too dangerous to sail in the wintertime. So for 3 months, they stay on this island. And Luke tells 2 stories. The first is the snake bite. This is a story about hospitality and also a story about healing as Paul's ministry continues. So in verse 7, there was an estate that belonged to Publius, who was the chief official of the island. He's the chief man of the island. Literally, it means he's the first man of the island, meaning of first importance on the island. And archaeologists have found some inscriptions with that exact title of the leader of the island of Malta. So this particular title that Luke uses, the chief official, is an official title. He didn't just make it up. It was what he was called. And so he owns this large estate. And he welcomes us to his home, and for 3 days entertains us hospitably. And the question is, who's the us? Here's my hypothesis. This man named Publius is the chief official of Malta. The chief official on the boat would have been Julius, the Roman centurion. It would have been common courtesy for Publius to invite Julius to his home and treat him hospitably. That would have been the common Roman courtesy thing to do. But at this point, Julius has some friends, including Paul. And I think he invited Paul to come with him. And when Paul came, Paul also brought his friends. So I don't think that all 276 people showed up at this man's house. I don't think anybody has a house for 276 people, not even this guy. But it could have been Julius and Paul and his Christian friends, some Roman soldiers, some other leaders who were on the boat. And for 3 days, he treats us hospitably. And once again, this idea of hospitality becomes very important. And again, Luke is emphasizing that Christians ought to be hospitable. And at the same time, the proper response that the Romans ought to make toward Christians is to be hospitable toward the Christians. That was part of what he was trying to get across. Well, when Paul goes to his home, Paul has an opportunity to return the favor. Publius has opened his home to Paul, fed him, taken care of him. But the father of Publius has a fever and dysentery. And this was probably gastric fever caused by a microbe in goat's milk. It's amazing how little bacteria or little viruses can cause such trouble to people. And again, this was probably a very microscopic thing. In fact, it was called Malta fever. So when you went to Malta, stay away from the goat's milk because you may end up with Malta fever. And Paul prays over him, places his hands on him, and he is healed. This is the only time in the book of Acts where Paul prays over somebody and lays hands on somebody to heal them. It is quite common today that, when you're praying over the sick, we'll lay hands on the sick and pray over them. But this is the only occurrence of that in the book of Acts. So you may ask, where did we get this idea of laying hands on people and praying over people? It's from this story in the book of Acts. And that's what Paul does, and the man is healed. And then the next verse says, when this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. That story traveled rather quickly. Many people heard about what Paul could do, and many came, and Paul healed them as well. This story is very similar to a story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. It's the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, who happened to be struck with a fever. And Jesus came and rebuked the fever, and the fever left her, and word traveled all over town very quickly that Jesus had done that. And Jesus spent the rest of that day healing people because they all came looking for him, knowing that Jesus had the power to do that. So, a very similar occurrence on Malta. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. At this point, they have no supplies. They all got thrown overboard in the previous boat. But as they get on a new boat and get ready to sail again, they don't sail empty-handed. These people furnish them with all the supplies that they need. Again, an example of hospitality, taking care of other people. Well, we're going to stop there tonight. Next week, we will make it to Rome. That was God's promise to Paul, and next week we will read the story of Paul arriving in Rome. And then the question becomes, what's Paul going to do in Rome, and what will happen to Paul once he gets to Rome? Well, we'll try to answer some of those questions next week. Well, let's wrap it up in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are a God who always keeps his promises. And one of your promises, God, is that you would never leave us, that you would never forsake us. Whether life is going incredibly well for us, or whether life is difficult, frustrating, sorrowful for us, you promise that you would never bail on us, that you would never leave us and never forsake us. So, Father, tonight as we look at our own life and what we're going through, may we recognize that your presence is with us. We can count on you. Circumstances may not be going our way, but you are here. You are present, and we can always count on you in everything that you've said to us. So, Father, may we trust your word, trust your presence, and trust your guidance in our lives. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.